from what you discovered?
I think the
small p.
Yeah, I think I didn't really approach the book looking for political lessons. I think that there are certainly lessons to be learned organizationally in how JSOC reorganized itself, largely under Stan McChrystal and then continued by Bill McRaven. From an organization, I mean, a large part of the book really is telling the story of how it went from an organization that was fairly small and designed for episodic operations, and then became an organization, had to turn itself into an organization that was capable of year-long, multi-year-long campaigns, 24/7 in multiple parts of the world simultaneously. So there are certainly organizational lessons there. How it engaged with the U.S. government and are another set of sort of lessons learned. But I think, going back to what I said earlier, from the policymaker's point of view, the lesson is, it's very important for a country like the United States, that has the interest of the United States, has to have an organization like JSOC that can do what it can do, and we should be very grateful that we have that. However, it's probably a mistake to rely on that organization to do everything for you, absent a more coherent strategy to solve your problems.
Okay. Thank you, Sean Naylor. Congratulations
again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was Afterwards, Book TV's signature program in which authors of the latest nonfiction books are interviewed. Watch past Afterwards programs online at booktv.org.
Good afternoon. I'm Tom Putnam, Director of the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum, and on behalf of Heather Campion, CEO of the Kennedy Library Foundation, and all of my Library and Library Foundation colleagues, I thank you for coming, welcome those watching on C-SPAN, and acknowledge the generous underwriters of the Kennedy Library Forum's lead sponsor, Bank of America, the Lowell Institute, the Boston Foundation, and our media sponsors, the Boston Globe, Xfinity, and WBUR. In reading Kate Clifford Larson's new book, Rosemary, the Hidden Kennedy Daughter, I was struck by an observation from Sister Margaret Ann, one of the caregivers in the later years in Wisconsin, that Rosemary had a magnetic personality. As others before us, we too are drawn to the story, perhaps like Greeks attending a theatrical tragedy. We know in advance the tragic ending to come and watch the actions of two of our protagonists. First, Rose Kennedy and her tireless efforts to educate and protect her eldest daughter, and later Joe, the patriarch, in his unending search for a cure that would not come, and then for the right placement where his beloved Rosemary could grow and feel productive. She was born in an age when intellectually challenged and learning disabled children had few options, bleak educational opportunities, and limited prospects to lead independent lives. Joseph B. Kennedy was, if anything, obsessively protective of his children, so fearful that one of his sons might die should the U.S. go to war in Europe, he did everything in his power, including disobeying the very president who appointed him ambassador, to prevent the outbreak of World War II. His greatest fears would come true, of course, losing his firstborn son, Joe Jr., and a few months later, his war-widowed daughter, Kathleen. Rosemary might also be considered a victim of that war, for the one setting where she most flourished was under the care of Mother Isabel of the Assumption Sisters at Belmont House outside of London, which Joe described in a letter to his wife as providing, quote, the ideal life for Rosemary. The school used the Montessori method, and since Rosemary was older than the other students, she served as Mother Isabel's kindly assistant. About this time, Kate Larson notes, Rosemary's favorite story to read to younger children was Winnie the Pooh, one of the few books she could read with confidence. But as the storm clouds of World War grew, Rosemary pleaded with her father not to move her from Belmont House. Yet thinking he was protecting her safety, he chose to send her back to rejoin the rest of their family in the United States, much as a few years hence he would make a similarly fateful medical decision. If we know the contours of this saga, Kate Larson unveils them to us in a refreshing manner. Trained as a historian and the author of 3 books, including a biography of Harriet Tubman, she's the first biographer to have access to many of Rosemary's letters, as well as newly released family materials here at the Kennedy Library. The New York Times describes this volume as, quote, a valuable account of a mental health tragedy and an influential's family's belated efforts to make amends. The book is on sale in our bookstore, and there'll be a book signing following the forum. Our moderator this afternoon, Eileen McNamara, is a professor of journalism at Brandeis University. A former Boston Globe columnist, she won the 1997 Pulitzer Prize for commentary only 18 months after she began writing her twice-weekly column. She became a columnist after more than 20 years as a reporter covering everything from the night police beat to the United States Congress. As a sign of the times in which she lived and the challenges she overcame, it should be noted that she began her career at the Globe as a newsroom secretary. She is currently working on a biography of Eunice Kennedy Shriver. And speaking of Mrs. Shriver, the last time she spoke here, Rosemary was very much on her mind, and I thought it might be appropriate to share a brief excerpt of her remarks as part of this introduction.
You will not be surprised to know that I believe that those same qualities were also the experience that shaped President Kennedy. Truthfully, I believe Rosemary's rejection had far more to go with the brilliance of his presidency than anyone can understand. Yes, he was our country's greatest champion of what we all call mental retardation. To this day, his legacy of innovation in creating an ICHD, the university-affiliated centers, the President's Council, remains today one of the great histories of our country. But beyond the work he did for people with intellectual disabilities, I believe it was Rosemary's influence that centralized him and all of us to the gifts of vulnerable and weak people. I think I can say that not one among the thousands who have written about him has understood what it is really like to be a brother of a person who has mental retardation. And tonight I want to say that, that I've never said before, more than any single individual, Rosemary had the greatest influence.
The new book concludes by describing the work of various members of the Shriver family to whom Mrs. Shriver passed her torch. Tim, the CEO of Special Olympics, echoes his mother's observation, suggesting that Rosemary belongs at the center of the Kennedy family story because her siblings were touched by witnessing her early struggles and the tragic turn in her life's trajectory. One can still picture Rosemary in those years in England when the world was most kind to her, reading Christopher Robin's words to his friend Pooh, quote, "Promise me you'll always remember, you're braver than you believe, stronger than you seem, and smarter than you think." Due to circumstances beyond her control, Rosemary Kennedy lived a diminished life. Yet we live in an age that is more fully sensitized to the bravery and strength of the vulnerable among us, and for that, may Rosemary Kennedy always be remembered. Please join me now in welcoming Kate Clifford Larson and Eileen McNamara to our stage.
Well, thank you all. We're feedbacking here. I don't know if that's okay.
Oh, it's the...
Oh, It's that. So, Kate, could you have picked a more challenging topic? You have a woman who disappeared from public view in 1941 when she was only 23 years old. Where does a biographer even begin? And more importantly, maybe why?
You know, those are two great questions. Why is easier to answer. Back in 2005, I saw Rosemary's obituary in the newspaper, and it was like a 3-paragraph obituary in the Boston Globe. And for some reason, it just hit me. I had been vaguely aware of Rosemary, and of course, I was very aware of the Kennedy family, having grown up in New England. And I just thought, oh, this life, you know, what happened to her? And as a women's historian, you know, my antenna went up right away, like, why don't we know more about her? So I tucked it in the back of my mind, and I was working on another book project, but I just had this sense that I should investigate her life, and that might be my next project. Mm-hmm. So when I did start researching her life, it might have been a little bit of naivete on my part, thinking I'd be able to unearth all this information and it won't be any problem, and I could write about this beautiful young woman and, you know, about what happened to her. The process took a lot longer than I thought because the record was, you know, a little bit spotty. But over the years, more and more papers became available, so it made it easier. But it is a challenge to write about somebody who disappears and who leaves few papers behind, but it is possible.
Tell us what you think about Rosemary's life before the lobotomy in 1941. Was she a happy child? Was she integrated into the life of that family?
Rosemary was an adorable child, happy, but also she struggled and suffered in trying to compete with her much more capable siblings. She was integrated into the family when she was home, and her siblings did a great job trying to accommodate her disabilities. They would play sports with her, they would go sailing with her, and they would take the helm but help her be part of that sailing. And tennis, all the sports activities that they were all capable of doing by themselves, she needed help, but they accommodated her, which of course influenced Eunice as an adult to start the Special Olympics. She knew that sports was an important aspect for every human being, but also for people with disabilities. Mm-hmm. And so she was happy on the one hand. On the other hand, she was very unhappy because of the struggles that she faced. And her parents also sent her off to many different schools over a period of 10 years. And that was very hard on a young child, teenager, young adult woman who was constantly separated from her family, who she loved very, very much and wanted to be with. So her life had bright moments, but also a lot of struggles.
I mean, she was only 11, I think, from reading your book, when she went to the first boarding school that they sent her to in Pennsylvania, if I'm correct. So she never did adjust very well when she had these big transitions in her life. And she never stayed at these schools very long, it seems. Did it not occur to her parents at some point that maybe this approach wasn't working for her?
It's not clear whether they understood that this bouncing her from one school to the next was actually harming her. I think they tried really hard to find a place where she could learn and be safe and achieve things that they expected her to achieve. And when those schools didn't seem to perform for them, they didn't wait, they just put her in another school. And that's unfortunate. And she suffered tremendously from the transitions from school to school.
In some ways, that means to me that they treated her a lot like they treated their other children. Because Teddy went to a dozen schools, I think. All the children moved. When Rose would move down to Florida for the winter, she would pull the kids out of school and then put them in school down there. So it must have been just standard operating procedure.
It was partly standard operating procedure, but also with Rosemary, she needed more time to make adjustments, and that was very unfair to her. And that was clear after the first transitions of a couple of different schools. Mm-hmm. And so it's unfortunate that Rose and Joe didn't take a step back and say, maybe we should pause here before we send her to a different school. They also had unrealistic expectations of her, and they expected that she would perform better in these schools, and she just couldn't. She was not capable, and at the time, most schools could not provide appropriate kind of educational programming for people with disabilities like Rosemary had. So they just were determined that they were going to cure her, and those were their words, cure her of her disabilities, when in fact we know that's not possible.
Right. In fact, maybe that delusion and maybe that approach sort of explains a little bit she was a fairly high-functioning young woman, wasn't she? I mean,
she was.
She was presented to the King and Queen of England as a debutante.
Right. She achieved, I would say, about a 4th grade education level. Her maturity level was probably about the same. It's hard to say because I never met her in person, but given what she writes in the letters that are here at the Kennedy Library, you can see that her emotional level is quite immature. But she could function, and today she certainly would be mainstreamed in classrooms, and as an adult perhaps even live independently with resources and support systems. But in those days, none of that was available.
And that stigma, does that stigma explain some of the duplicity that you describe in the book, where Rose and Joe didn't exactly reveal everything about Rosemary's abilities when they put her in one school or another school? They sort of suggested that she was higher functioning than she was.
Right. The first school they sent her away to when she was 11 years old was the Devereaux School in Pennsylvania, and that was a specific school created for children with intellectual disabilities. And the woman who ran the school was very successful with other students. But because the Kennedys believed that Rosemary could be cured, they really were not willing to accept that label that she had disabilities. They were not pleased with her progress there. So they moved her to other schools, traditional schools, and she could not keep up with classmates. Even though she might be put in a classroom with other 8th graders, let's say, she still could only perform at a 4th grade level. And the Kennedys, Joe and Rose, did not inform most of the teachers that this was actually what was going on with Rosemary. So they had expectations, the teachers had expectations of Rosemary, her parents did, and Rosemary could not meet those expectations. So they were duplicitous, and I don't know how they thought these teachers were going to perform some miracle on Rosemary, particularly after they go through 2, 3 more schools and things are not changing. So it seemed more like they just wanted Rosemary sent away somewhere rather than really trying to find an appropriate educational setting.
Was her progress complicated too by the family either not recognizing or not wanting to acknowledge that this wasn't simply a case of intellectual disabilities? You make wonderful use of the primary sources here at the library, where you quote teachers who talk about her belligerence, her acting out. It seems that there was mental illness combined with intellectual disabilities.
As Rosemary aged into her teen years and young adulthood, it became apparent that there was more going on than just simply a young person's frustrations at being having expectations they can't meet. As many people who have intellectual disabilities do have frustrations and they do lash out, but things that were going on with Rosemary indicate that perhaps there were some mental health issues emerging when she was in her teen years. And certainly as a young adult woman, mental illness began to appear in Rosemary, and her parents clearly were not sure what they should do about that other than quiet her, silence her.
And she never really received mental health treatment, did she? I mean, all of these efforts were designed to improve her academic performance. It doesn't sound like there was much of an effort made to deal with her emotional problems.
No, and of course, you brought up the issue of stigma. First of all, there was a stigma attached to having a child with intellectual disabilities. There were horrific phrases that they used at the time period, like moron and imbecile, and Rose and Joe, here they have this beautiful daughter, and they certainly don't want those labels placed on their daughter. So they thought they could shift her away and hide those those disabilities. But when it came to mental illness, they weren't equipped to deal with it, and frankly, neither was the medical establishment as well. People were warehoused in horrific institutions, people who had mental illness, and for Rosemary, there really weren't medications except for maybe a barbiturate that would have put her to sleep or calmed her down. So there were very few resources. Rose and Joe were smart enough to know that there might be mental health issues going on with Rosemary because they did investigate placing her in a psychiatric institution in the fall of 1941, and those records are here in the library. They ended up not doing that. I'm not clear why, but they were aware, excuse me, that she had some mental health issues.
It's interesting because, as you say, the options weren't that many in the 40s. It wasn't until the late 50s that we start getting psychotropic drugs that can help people with mental illness.
Right.
And so lobotomies perhaps seemed like a logical choice, although it may sound horrific to us today.
So it is horrific, and I feel pretty strongly that it didn't necessarily look like the best option. At the time that Joe Kennedy started investigating lobotomies, they were being done by a pair of doctors in Washington, D.C., Walter Freeman and James Watts. And they were basically experimenting. It was very rarely done across the world, and they had operated on fewer than 100 patients by the time they performed the lobotomy on Rosemary. And the American Medical Association was clear that spring and summer. They reported that they felt that it was too experimental, the side effects were too dramatic, and that lobotomies needed to be researched more before they continued performing them on live patients. Joe was a really smart man. He would have known that. He would have had that resource. He would have known that the American Medical Association was not recommending it. But he went ahead and had her lobotomized anyway.
Why?
I think he felt he needed to silence her in a way and make her more, as the doctors would have told him, more compliant, more pliable, less emotional.
Mm-hmm. And what were the consequences of that lobotomy for Rosemary?
So the best case scenario would have been that she would have been sort of devoid of feeling and pliable and compliant, but that rarely happened. For Rosemary, she became completely disabled, physically and intellectually disabled. She left that operation not being able to walk or talk. She had a permanent physical disability as a result of the lobotomy. She regained the ability to speak a few words, a few phrases, and she could never take care of herself again for the rest of her life.
Which leads to the question that's really bothered everybody who's heard this story since they read Doris Kearns Goodwin's book in 1988, when Rose told her that she didn't see her daughter for 20 years after this lobotomy. How could that be? And why?
I wish I had an answer. As a mother, I cannot imagine not seeing my child for 20 years. I think perhaps Rose always looked forward. Her whole life, she had many disappointments, but she was committed to looking forward, and she looked to her faith to guide her and move forward. And I think she did with this instance as well. Rosemary was going to be institutionalized, and so she didn't need to see her daughter anymore, and she would concentrate on the rest of her children. However, I still, it's all well and good to say that, but really, how do you not see your child for 20 years? I can't get my head around that. I really can't. And Joe, of course, maybe saw her for a couple of years, and then he stopped visiting her as well. And that is remarkable to me, because Rosemary was still cognizant. She knew her family. She remembered her siblings. She knew her parents, but she didn't see them.
And she comes back into their lives in the early 70s. We start seeing Eunice go out to visit her and bring her back. Joe was dead by then.
Right.
So was the death of the ambassador like a precipitating act that brought her back into the family?
I think that was part of it. I think Eunice did a tremendous amount of work bringing out the story of Rosemary, who had intellectual disabilities after the president had been elected. Her brother Jack had been elected. So during the 1960s, the public was becoming more and more used to having conversations about people with intellectual disabilities, so they could talk about Rosemary more. And once the ambassador died in 1969, I think Rose, who is becoming quite elderly herself, now had more time to reconnect with her daughter and to reintegrate Rosemary into the family. I think the Shrivers had been spending time with Rosemary during the late 60s anyway, but by the 1970s, Rosemary started making trips to Hyannisport and Palm Beach and was spending more time with her siblings and her nieces and nephews that she was meeting for the first time, and they were getting to know her, and certainly they became inspired by her. Yeah.
You tell a really poignant and sad story in the book about Rosemary's first encounter with her mother after those 20 years. Do you want to recount it for the audience?
So this comes from one of the sisters at St. Coletta's in Jefferson, Wisconsin, where Rosemary spent the last 50 years of her life. And she recoiled when she saw her mother for the first time. She knew who her mother was. She knew that she hadn't seen her mother. Did she blame her mother for the lobotomy? I'm not really sure. Did she blame her father? Not really sure. That hasn't been recorded, but certainly pain and anger and anguish were part of her lived experience, and that all came flooding back to her when she saw her mother.
Well, you know, that runs so counter to in the popular imagination how we think of Rose Kennedy. The narrative has always been of this doting mother who hovers above her children. Was that your experience in your research of Rose Kennedy?
Well, she hovered in a certain way. Certainly, she viewed herself as a very professional mother, and she looked to the Catholic faith to guide her in being a mother, and that she would be at home and she would train her children to be good citizens and good Catholics and good people, and that was her mission. And I think she did do that. They were good people, good Catholics. I didn't see her as a terribly warm person. Joe, their father, was definitely much more demonstrative emotionally with his children than Rose was. So she was very cold and in some ways, I mean, she loved her children, certainly, but she had a way about her that was not very warm and cuddly. She was dedicated to Rosemary. I mean, friends of theirs, in testimony to other historians who have written about the family, talked about the amount of time that Rose spent with Rosemary when she was a child, helping her with her schoolwork, working with her, on the tennis court, and spending a lot more time with her than she did with the other children. So, there's that side of Rose that she had this sort of job that she wanted to do, and she wanted to provide the best for her children, and so she did that in the best way that she could. But she also wanted her own life, and she would spend months at a time traveling around Europe and leave the children with governesses and nurses, and the letters that Rosemary writes home, and you can see them here in the library, are heartbreaking. She misses her mother, and she misses her father and her siblings, and she, was like, I'm trying so hard. If I'm good, can I come home? And this is actually one of the really sad parts of the schools that she was sent to, particularly the one that was a school for intellectually disabled. They used behavior and doing well in school as a sort of a ticket home. So if Rosemary did well and if she behaved well, then she could go home for Thanksgiving. If she didn't, then she couldn't. Now, for an 11-year-old girl, I can't imagine that kind of requirement. And she wrote a series of letters home. I'm trying to be good. Are you sure? I want to come home for Thanksgiving, and please, will you tell Mrs. Devereaux that I can come home for Thanksgiving? It's just heartbreaking.
You do have a sense in those letters. I mean, and she writes to her siblings as well. And of just a desperately lonely little girl who wanted nothing more than to be part of this big, obstreperous family.
Right.
She may have been overwhelmed by them, but
Right.
she clearly missed them.
She missed them. And she also had a sense that she was the older sister. So on the one hand, she's immature and not quite as capable as her younger sister Kathleen, Kik, and Eunice. So she sort of talks to them in a sort of a very childlike way. At the same time, she's aware she's the older sister. And she says to them, now, I want you to write me a letter. You be a good girl and write. And so there's this, you know, she has this conflicting thing going on, but it's so adorable. It is just so precious. It really is amazing.
Poignant.
Yes, very poignant.
And after the surgery, tell us about the woman that emerges. I mean, those first 10 years are obviously very difficult years because she doesn't have the rehabilitation that she gets later on in her life.
Right.
Once she's at St. Coletta's and there are people working with her, there are physical therapists, she gets some language back. Tell us about what her life was like there.
I think it was much happier there. We have really no records to speak of what happened to her at Craig House. It was a psychiatric hospital north of New York City where she was sent after she healed from the lobotomy. So probably in 1942, several months after her surgery, she was sent to Craig House, which was not really equipped to help a disabled person like Rosemary regain her abilities. So she ended up at St. Coletta's, and those nuns were remarkable. They helped her regain some speech. She exercised every day. Rose ended up paying for a pool through Rosemary's Trust Fund to build a pool so that she could go swimming every day. And interestingly, in one of the records, one of the sisters talks about how they stopped giving Rosemary medication that she had been taking for a very long time. And all of a sudden, Rosemary started talking. So obviously, they had been over-medicating her probably from the Craig House years. And but it took the sisters at St. Coletta's and some of the physicians that they were working with to recognize that maybe Rosemary didn't need these sedating medicines anymore or as much, and she kind of blossomed after that.
And the Kennedys built her own little cottage on the grounds at St. Coletta's.
That's right.
She had a dog.
She had a dog and a bird. And so she had a full life. She loved to go shopping. The nuns would take her into town and they would go shopping. Joe provided a car, and the nuns would drive Rosemary in the car into town. And she had friends at St. Coletta's. There were a couple of women that were there that she spent time with every single day. So she had friendships, and she had a routine that she was used to and happy with. And in fact, I think she was so happy in that context that when she started making the visits to Hyannisport and Palm Beach, they were very disruptive for her, and it was a very difficult time. Not only was she resentful towards her mother, but that transition to an unfamiliar place was very hard on her. So it probably wasn't always the best Rosemary who appeared in those instances.
And those visits continued. Eunice continued to bring her out, right, until the end of her life?
Yes, exactly. She would attend Special Olympics events. There were pictures of her, in Hyannis and also Palm Beach, going to church, things like that.
So part of this story resonates with you.
Yeah, it does.
You were attracted to her story because of some of your own personal experiences. Right. Are you comfortable sharing those with us?
When I started researching this in 2008, I was researching it because I'm a women's historian and I was fascinated by the story. But a couple of years into the research, my son was diagnosed with schizophrenia, and all of a sudden, my husband and I were thrown into this world of having to take care of a child with a very serious disability, a very serious mental illness. And what parents go through and what you need to do and what you want to do for your child. So I got a slightly different perspective on Rose and Joe. So I became a little bit more harsh in my opinion of them. On the other hand, I became also more sympathetic. It's a lot of hard work to have a child with disabilities. The Kennedys had a tremendous amount of money. They could have used those resources even more so to take care of Rosemary. And even today, if this happened to a young woman With a family like that, with those resources, there are ways to take care of someone with severe mental illness. But for the average family who doesn't have the money, the resources are not there, and it is we've done a lot for people with intellectual disabilities and physical disabilities. Our nation has not done enough for people with mental illness and the families that love them.
And I think it's true, isn't it, that we've come so far in dealing with intellectual disabilities that the stigma isn't as great as it once was.
Right.
And even when Mrs. Shriver wrote the Saturday Evening Post piece in 1962, which basically revealed to the world that Rosemary had intellectual disabilities, that piece does not talk about the mental illness piece.
Yeah.
There's no mention of it.
Right. And I don't think the family ever really looks at it that way, except Patrick Kennedy, who recently came out with his own personal story and that of the family. And he does say in his book that clearly Rosemary had mental illness, and but the family would never talk about that. And he wants his family to talk about that. I want the whole country to start talking about it, because we need to have that conversation. We need to get rid of that stigma. And I think the Kennedy family is still living with the fears of that stigma, but we should not. We should all be talking about this and find ways to provide more resources.
So you began this journey as a professional historian,
Right.
wanting to tell a woman's story,
Right.
and you wound up with a cause.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Thanks to Rosemary, who obviously that's her legacy, that she has given many of the Kennedys today a cause. And for me, she's giving me this platform as well. And I had an interview the other day on WBUR, and Lisa Mullins said Rosemary was a muse. Well, what a beautiful way to describe Rosemary. She was a muse for her family, her siblings, who went on to really affect a tremendous amount of change for people with disabilities. And so hopefully she'll continue to be a muse.
Should we open it up to our audience? Thank you. Would you like their questions? Kate would be happy to take your questions if you have some, so don't be shy. Yes, sir.
Hi, how are you? I was curious what happened to the two physicians. Did Joe ever go after them, or did he just ignore the fact that they had butchered his daughter?
We have no idea. The records are not available because they're medical records, so those are closed. And even records that aren't completely medical records have disappeared. They're, at George Washington University, they're just not there, so we have no idea. I didn't find a lawsuit or anything like that, so he did not, at least publicly or even through the courts, he didn't do anything.
So they continued to do lobotomies?
James Watts and Walter Freeman continued working together for several more years, and then Freeman went off and he became the famous lobotomist, and he developed the ice pick lobotomy procedure, and he lobotomized thousands of people, thousands of them.
And just to give us some historical context, lobotomies were performed routinely right through the 50s.
Through the 50s.
And the man who originated the lobotomy won a Nobel Prize in 1949.
Yeah.
So we look back at horror at what happened to Rosemary, but people thought it was going to be the miracle cure in the 40s.
Right. And when I did my research on lobotomies, there were a couple of interesting things about it. One is that there were some successes, but when I looked at the research of Freeman and Watts, and they also had another doctor they worked with, Thelma Hunt, they were touting the success of this operation, that the great majority of the patients were much better off. But actually, when you looked at their research, the great majority were far worse off. Many had died or were completely crippled like Rosemary. So they weren't truthful in their work. They lied. And then as lobotomies became more popular, I discovered that between 60 and 80% of the patients were women, when women were only 40% of psychiatric admissions. So more women were subjected to this operation than men. And of course, in those days, there were no patient protections, and a father, brother, husband could, have this done to their loved ones very easily. without a
Imagine
recourse.
somebody wanting to silence women. I just can't imagine. Shocking. Yes.
Hi, my name is Carolyn Clark. I'm a docent here at the Kennedy Library. Patrick recently publicly said that his family was very disturbed about the appearance of his book. I was wondering what the response was in the family to your book.
I have heard nothing. Simple.
Nothing.
Nothing. Nothing.
Interesting. Yes, sir.
Can you speak to the circumstances of Rosemary's birth?
Absolutely. I opened the book with the circumstances of Rosemary's birth. It was September of 1918, and the Spanish influenza had already made a sweep around the globe and killed millions of people, and it was making a second pass around the globe, and it was hitting Boston in September of 1918, and thousands of people had died, and thousands more were in the hospitals. Rose's obstetrician, or doctor at the time, was busy at a hospital when she went into labor. She had a nurse with her to help monitor her and keep her calm and get her ready. But Rose's labor became fast and furious, and she wanted to deliver that baby, but the obstetrician wasn't there. And the nurse, who had been trained how to deliver a baby, requested that Rose hold that baby back, because the priority, even though the nurse had been trained, was to wait for the doctor to come and deliver that child. Well, of course, Rose couldn't hold the baby back. You just can't do that. So the nurse held baby Rosemary back in the birth canal. So clearly, and it was for apparently a couple of hours. So baby Rosemary was deprived of oxygen. That certainly would have contributed to her intellectual disabilities. Women. Poor women.
Yeah, I think you've left them breathless. That raises a question for me is, we, as historians, you can look back and perhaps that's what happened. But how do we know?
We don't know for sure, but we know that did happen. So, and it,
yeah.
Right.
You have said that the families had no reaction that you're aware of to the book. Could you share any members of the family that you may have spoken with? Did you speak with Ambassador Smith, who would have lived through those years you're detailing alongside her sister and as the only surviving sibling, or any other family members?
I did speak to the Shrivers. Timothy and Anthony were very gracious, and actually I had several conversations with Anthony Shriver, who provided a couple of the photographs for the book of Rosemary as a disabled adult. He was incredibly gracious. I spoke to a couple of distant cousins, Charlie Burke on the Cape, and I reached out to the ambassador, but no response. From what I understand from the Shrivers and others is that the younger generations know nothing about what happened to Rosemary. And in fact, Anthony had said to me that they didn't know what happened to Rosemary, and perhaps I could find out and let them know. So I certainly was able to find out some things that happened to Rosemary. Actually, it's a rich story that I was able to uncover. And Patrick Kennedy recently came out and said his family never talked about any of these quote-unquote secrets. He grew up not knowing anything about not only Rosemary, but his own father and other people. So it's not surprising that the younger generations have no knowledge. And Jean, of course, she was a teenager, maybe 13, 14 years old, when Rosemary disappeared from the family. So, and Rose... Oh, yes, absolutely. Rosemary
also plays a role in the work that the ambassador's done.
Absolutely. The whole family was transformed because of Rosemary. There's no question about that. Jack and Eunice and Senator Kennedy and Bobby, all of them, and their wives. It's very clear. That's Rosemary's legacy. If there is a tragedy, there's also this incredible outcome, the way that they were able to affect change for millions of people around this country and around the world.
Ma'am.
Yes. Do they still perform that procedure, and have they replaced it with something else that's similar?
Lobotomies are very, very rarely performed today. I think they use lasers, in fact, today. Don't quote me on that, but I think they do.
And there are several states where it's illegal.
Yeah, I think most across the country. And so if there are certain cases where it is recommended, and according to laws and medical boards, there has to be a specific patient board and a medical board that has to review the case. The hospital has to donate the time and the services, the equipment. The doctor has to donate his time, and no one gets paid for it. It's only used in extreme cases. And I spoke to a friend who's a neurosurgeon, and he has done it twice. I think he said twice in his career, and it was for people who had been institutionalized basically in straitjackets for their whole lives in psychiatric hospitals. And this particular surgery is incredibly effective for a particular type of mental illness. And so the two patients he told me about were able to leave the psychiatric hospital, get a high school, college, master's degrees, and live independent lives. So it does happen, but it's with great, great care, and it's not very often.
The president did assign Eunice as special needs because of Rosemary, because he knew that she and the family that was like presented when she became head of special needs.
And Eileen would probably know more about this than me, but I think Eunice got President Kennedy to...
I think we get that a little back.
Yeah.
Reverse,
I think Eunice got the president to pay attention to this issue.
Absolutely.
Kate, I'd like to salute your beautiful, fantastic book.
Thank you.
And besides the problem with Rosemary, this could make awareness of this book to many other problems in the United States with disability. So I respect and thank you so much, Kate.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, if there isn't anything else, no other questions, then we are thrilled that you came, delighted that you participated, and our author will be outside signing books for you.
Thank you, Eileen.
Is there a nonfiction author or book you'd like to see featured on Book TV? Send us an email, booktv@cspan.org. Tweet us @BookTV, or post a comment on our wall, facebook.com/booktv.
And you're watching Book TV on C-SPAN 2. We are in Las Vegas, attending the Freedom Fest, and we're interviewing authors out here. And joining us now is somebody who's been on Book TV before for previous books. Michael Shermer is his name. The book is called The Moral Arc. Mr. Shermer, in this book, The Moral Arc, you write that during the years I spent researching and writing this book, when I told people that the subject was moral progress, to describe the responses I received as incredulous would be an understatement. Most people thought I was hallucinatory.
Yeah, that's right. Well, the problem is that, of course, like everybody else, I too watch the news. And if you only watch the news, it seems like things are bad and getting worse. But in fact, what I'm trying to do in the Moral Arc is track the long-term historical progress over centuries and millennia, not days and hours and weeks. So in other words, follow the trend lines, not the headlines. And if you just think about it for a second, take the bigger picture, the abolition of slavery. It's illegal in every country in the world, even though it's practiced in a few corrupt governments. It's practiced nowhere in the Western world anymore. The abolition of torture, it's now illegal in all Western democracies. The right to vote by blacks, by women, everywhere in the world in all democracies. The spread of democracy itself is a form of moral progress. There are now 118 democracies in the world. In 1900, there were only a couple. Actually, the United States wasn't even really a liberal democracy until 1920 when women got the vote. So that's the kind of big progress steps that I'm talking about. Civil rights movement, same-sex marriage is now legal as of just barely a week and a half.
And that you include in the moral arc.
Oh yes, absolutely. Yep. In other words,
some people would say no.
Well, I know, but they're traditionalists who want to conserve the old hierarchical, sort of class-based society, whereas the long-term trend is to grant more individuals more autonomy and freedom and liberty over their own body, their own mind. In other words, here we are at Freedom Fest. This is what it's all about, is that it's my mind, it's my body. I can do whatever I want. You can't tell me what to do as long as I'm not hurting somebody else. And so two people that are in love that want to get married, who cares? It's none of your business what they do. None of my business, as long as no one's hurt, and no one's hurt. So, that's the kind of step in the right direction. And having that as a standard, that is the rights of an individual to have the power and autonomy and choice over his own mind and body, that's what's been happening, expanding the moral sphere to include more people for that over the last, say, 250 years or so, since the Enlightenment.
Is the moral arc the same as morality?
Yes, well, so I'm doing two things in the moral arc. First, I'm tracking the fact that things are getting better and that changes have happened. And then I'm grounding it based on what? What's the criteria? Well, the survival and flourishing of sentient beings is my moral starting point. That is, making sure that sentient beings like us and other higher animals like primates don't suffer. So Jeremy Bentham, one of the great utilitarian philosophers, started off by saying about animal rights, it's not can they think or can they talk, but can they suffer? So we begin with the suffering of other people. Do people have a right to not suffer at the hands of somebody else? So you not causing somebody else to suffer is a moral decision. And so I also make the argument, by the way, for free will. Even though most scientists, most of my scientist friends believe in determinism, I make an argument for free will. That is, morality requires moral choice. You could have done otherwise. You could have harmed somebody, you chose not to. And that choice is where the moral decision comes from. And so what we've been doing as a society for 200 years, well, since the Enlightenment and the founding of the United States, and the idea of a constitution with a Bill of Rights, is that we're saying everybody should be treated equally under the law. That's a new idea. That's only a couple centuries old. Rights were invented in the late 18th century, and they've taken off ever since.
How did the Enlightenment begin?
Well, the Enlightenment began with the idea that we can use reason and logic and empiricism, science, to answer questions about the world. It really began with Galileo and Newton and the scientific revolution, which was the point of that, the bigger point was that the universe is governed by natural laws and principles that can be discovered and then applied to change the world. So physics, biology, medicine, these all started it off, but shortly after Newton, everybody in Europe and the UK and then eventually the United States wanted to emulate Newton. They wanted to be the Newton of economics, the Newton of society, the Newton of culture. That is, discover the principles that guide, say, an economy. So before the Enlightenment, there was no economics. Before Adam Smith, there was no science of economics. Everybody thinks Adam Smith's famous book is called The Wealth of Nations. That's not the title of his book. The title of his book is An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. It's a book of science. He's inquiring into, well, what is wealth? And where does it come from? Because we want more of it for more people. How do we do that? There must be some principles behind it that we can discover and then apply to governments and societies to increase the prosperity of everybody in the society. So everybody's been doing that since then. Jefferson's idea of structuring a government in a certain way to increase the prosperity, the happiness, the pursuit of property, and so on. That's the idea. It's a scientific pursuit.
From your book, the Bible is one of the most immoral works in all literature.
Well, that's a pretty strong statement. Yes. And I don't like to offend my religious friends, but the point of that statement is that if you turn to the Bible, strictly speaking, as a literal reading, it by today's standards, especially the Old Testament, is a pretty immoral book. I mean, nobody today practices any of the laws in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, for example. Death penalty for disobedient children, for non-virginal wives, for mixing cotton and linen, for working on the Sabbath. I mean, these were laws that were written for another time, for another people. And I would put the abomination of same-sex relationships, that is in that same category, that we really don't need to be following that. It's an archaic system. We can do better. We've already done better. Most of the founding fathers of the United States were not religious. They were deists at best, but the point of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights is it doesn't matter what your religion is, or if you're not religious at all. These are still the laws of the land, and you have to obey them, and I have to obey them, and these are the rights that everybody gets, regardless of what your religion is and who's the dominant religion in the country. We don't care about that. These are the laws.
Michael Shermer, has the U.S. been a proponent or an advocate of a more moral society?
I think so, for the most part. I mean, of course, we have setbacks that people will call attention to. Slavery is the obvious one, but we abolished it. Now, granted, it took a war and 660,000 dead to abolish it ultimately, but the mistreatment of the Native Americans, the granting of the right to women to vote only in 1920. I mean, that took many decades. It took over half a century. So, I mean, we're slow, but we get there, along with other democracies. So free markets and liberal democracies are the two best combinations we have for a country to shift from a theocracy, from a hierarchical structure where most people are poor and impoverished and have few freedoms, to where virtually everybody in society is fairly prosperous and has liberty. And the United States is one of the champions of that. It's not the only one, but the constitutional republic is a good system.
What's a scientific explanation that free market capitalism leads to a moral society, a more moral society?
Sure, yes. Well, two things. One, if you want to generate more prosperity for more people, that does make life better for everybody. And capitalism is every economist knows that's the best way to increase prosperity, not just for the 1% at the top, but for everybody at the bottom. But more importantly, psychologically, what trade does is it breaks down tribal barriers. I don't know you, but if you and I swap money for goods or services, I don't care what race you are, what tribe you're from, what religion you are. It doesn't matter. You've treated me properly by contract. I've treated you properly by exchange, and so on. And that's one of the big benefits to trade. It's a little bit like travel, having open borders, and people that travel a lot tend to be more liberal in terms of freedom and tolerance of differences than other people that don't travel as much. So it's that encountering other people that are different from you, in which you don't have to kill them or enslave them. You can actually do something that benefits them that also benefits you. And that's been one of the great benefits of capitalism that almost nobody sees. I mean, most academics are liberals. Most liberals don't see capitalism as a good thing. But it really is one of the best things ever invented.
You say that you worked on this book for several years.
Yeah, it took a long time. Well, because
Why?
It's dealing with topics that I didn't know that much about. The history of war, what caused the decline of war. I mean, what do you mean war is decline? It seems like all you hear about is people fighting. Well, when's the last time any of the great powers went to war? 1945 was the last time. If the proxy wars like Korea and Vietnam, those kinds of wars are decreasing. Although it's true there's still a few genocides, nothing like the Holocaust or the tragedies of Mao and Stalin, Pol Pot and so on. Those are anomalies compared to today, even though there's still bad things that happen. ISIS is bad, but ISIS is tiny compared to what, say, somebody a century ago, some nasty dictator might have done half a century ago. So we're getting a handle even on the bad guys. So when I talk about moral progress, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. There are always going to be enough bad things to fill the evening news that if you're a pessimist, you have no trouble finding evidence for your pessimism. But if you pull back and take the long view, again, trend lines, not headlines, you'll see, hey, things really are getting better.
You have a pin in your lapel there that says Skeptic. What is that?
Yep, well, Skeptic is the name of my magazine. I'm the publisher of Skeptic magazine. We're a science magazine that basically investigates all kinds of controversial claims, global warming, just terrorism. Is terrorism a threat? This is our newest issue. Is terrorism an existential threat? No. There's a lot of myths. So we are the mythbusters, as it were.
What do you teach at Chapman?
Chapman, I teach a course called Skepticism 101, how to think like a scientist and not be a geek is what it's called. Basically, I'm taking 18-year-olds right out of high school and teaching them how to use their brains, turning their brains from mush into critical thinking machines.
What does it mean to think scientifically?
Just using reason, thinking critically.